السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. واتفقوا على تحريم رواية الموضوع إلا مقرونا ببيانه لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم: من حدث عني بحديث يرى أنه كذب فهو أحد الكاذبين، أخرجه مسلم. Thus, Ibn Hajar Rahmallah explained the ruling with regards to making up and fabricating a hadith. So he explained that it's not permissible to invent a narration and to attribute it to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he explained that it is a major sin. So he now explains the ruling of merely quoting a fabrication. So someone else concocted and made up the report. Now will it be permissible to quote it? So you're not making it up. Someone else made it up. You just want to quote it. So he says, وَاتَّفَقُوا, there is ittifaq, there is consensus that it is haram to even quote a mawdu' narration. And there is no distinction irrespective whether it is with regards to ahkam or fadail, targhib or tarhib, or tariq, or siyar, or manaqib, or if it's just an incident or any other topic. There is no concession at all to quote a fabrication against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But there is one exception, illa maqarunam bibayanihi, that it is where a person is quoting the fabrication just to make it clear and to notify and to outline that this is a baseless report, and therefore it cannot be attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is in light of this that books of mawdu'at are written, as we will inshallah discuss shortly. So Ibn Hajar Rahmallah now gives one narration as a proof to show how it is not permissible to even quote a fabrication. And he says, لِقَوْلِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم مَنْ حَدَّثَ عَنِّي بِحَدِيثٍ يُرَى. So here, instead of reading it as yara, you can read it as yara, then it will be in the meaning of ya'taqidu. If you read it with a fatha on the ya, it will mean that he is convinced that it is a mawdu' narration. But when you are reading it with a dhamma, it means that he just thinks that it is a fabrication. So even if a person has doubt on a narration, that is this an authentic report or is it a fabrication? So therefore, Mullah al-Qari says, وَهُوَ أَبْلَغ. It's better to read it with a dhamma, because then it also suits the way Ibn Hajar Rahmallah is mentioning it here. That if a person is to just assume a narration is a fabrication and he has to narrate it, فَهُوَ أَحَدُ الْكَاذِبِينَ. Thus you can read it as كاذبين or كاذبين بصيغة الجمع باعتباره كثرة النقلة, by taking into consideration that from all the different people who lied against the Prophet ﷺ, this is also one person who lied. Or you can take it and read it as كاذبين. That means between the one who reported it to him and between he himself, he is also a liar. So as long as he's not absolutely convinced that something is from the Prophet ﷺ, if he has to relate it, then he is also a liar and he shares in the sin. Akhrajahu Muslim. Imam Muslim rahmallah, when he was narrating this in the Muqaddamah, then he first mentioned this narration, and thereafter he mentioned the sanad wa tahwil in the sanad. So when you are doing Sahih Muslim, the Ustad must have explained the reason for doing that. Now here, while there is consensus on the impermissibility of quoting fabricated narrations, there are many scholars who, knowingly or unknowingly, they still quoted narrations which were not established. So Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim says, وَمَعَ هَذَا الْإِتِّفَاقِ فقد وقع التساهل في تطبيق هذا، فهناك أئمة ومحدثون رووا أحاديث موضوعة وأثبتوها في كتبهم وتركوا القدح فيها وبيان وضعها. He's saying that although there is ittifaq, everyone agreed that you cannot quote fabricated narrations, there were still scholars. He's saying أئمة, and he's saying even muhaddithun, they narrated mawdu' narrations وأثبتوها في كتبهم, and they even related these mawdu' narrations in their books, وَتَرَكُوا الْقَدْحَ فِيهَا وَبِيَانِ وَضْعِهَا, and they did not outline, they did not make it clear that these are fabrications. So when we are doing Muqaddamah Ibn Salah, then we done how Ibn Salah rahmallah refuted the scholars of tafsir who narrated fabrications. So basically, if we come to know that a particular scholar quoted a narration which is fabricated, then just as scholars would always do throughout time, we also need to admit that it is a fabrication. So we cannot come up with lame arguments and go into detail explaining what a great muhaddith a particular sheikh was. And so on that basis, we try to say that there are no fabrications in his book. Why? Because by trying to hold on to straws like that, we are just shooting ourselves in the foot. Because if you do that, then a person can take that narration and show you that lots of other senior muhaddithun have clearly mentioned that the narration is a fabrication. In fact, he will show you that besides the author of that book, all other scholars, not even majority, all other scholars have said that the narration is baseless. So now if you are trying to say that this author is such a great muhaddith and therefore he did not quote the fabrications, maybe he knew that it's not a fabrication, and therefore he narrated it, then what are you going to say about all those other muhaddithun? So not majority, all those other muhaddithun who clearly mentioned that the hadith is a fabrication. Furthermore, it will mean that any past scholar, whoever mentioned that another scholar narrated fabrications, it would mean that the scholar is not regarding that person as a muhaddith, or maybe does it mean that he's not respecting him? How is he saying that he narrated fabrications? So this shows us that by clarifying that a particular sheikh quoted a fabrication, it does not mean that we are saying he's not a muhaddith or he's not a sheikh al-hadith. Like Imam Zahabi rahmallah, he said with regards to Abu Nu'aym ibn Manda rahmallah, لا أعلم لهما ذنبا أكثر من روايتهما الموضوعات ساكتين عنها. So now will this mean that he is disrespectful to these two great scholars? Likewise, will it mean that Alama ibn Salah rahmallah in the commentators, they are disrespectful to all those scholars of tafsir because they are mentioning that they narrated mawdu' narrations? No, they're just being honest. So in the same way, if we know that a particular narration is a fabrication, then we also need to be honest and admit that it is a fabrication. And thereafter, if you are discussing about a particular author, you can explain the reason why he narrated that fabrication. Did he merely follow others and he did not research the sanad himself? So maybe he took from a book of an earlier scholar and he thought that an earlier scholar researched the narration, and therefore just in emulation to him, he narrated it. And thereafter, you can so you can explain all of these, and then you can explain that how that the fact that he quoted these fabrications by following a previous scholar, it does not diminish his status, because there were numerous scholars from the very early days who quoted fabrications. So you have to have academic honesty, that you have to firstly admit that the narration is a fabrication, and then you can give the excuse. So here, if you realize that I'm referring to one very important book, وَالْعَاقِلُ تَكْفِيهِ الْعِشَارَةِ وَالْغَبِيُّ لَا تُفِيدُ الصَّرَاحَةِ. And actually, I myself made ta'lim of that book, whether at home or in the masjid. So I'm not in any way diminishing the status. In fact, I read that book just last night after Isha as-Salah in the masjid. So nevertheless, the fact that the author mentioned fabrications in there, you cannot now go and say that it's a great scholar, and therefore that the hadith is not fabricated. Rather, it was, and actually, yeah, Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim, he lists quite a few books which all have fabrications. So he takes the names of Hilya of Abu Nu'aym. He mentions the books of Ibn Abi Dunya. He mentions the books of Imam Tabarani, rahimahullah, his Ma'ajim. Likewise, the books of Abu Shaykh al-Asbahani. And in fact, you can also include Sunan Ibn Majah in that list. That if someone has to come and ask you that how come this particular book has a mawdu' narration, then you can say how come Sunan Ibn Majah has a mawdu' narration. So if you want to reject the Sunan, this book because of a fabricated narration, then you also need to reject Sunan Ibn Majah. And likewise, we just mentioned about Ibn Salah quoting all the books of tafsir and even many fiqh books. So their excuse was probably they never get the time to research it. But obviously, it is a taint. That is, it would have been better. And that is why Ibn Salah rahmallah, and that is why scholars, basically all scholars, then refuted those who narrated. And in fact, what this book which I'm referring to, the Shaykh al-Ḥadīth who passed away recently, he himself admitted and also refuted that his sheikh narrated. And obviously he took the place of his sheikh. So it does not mean by clarifying that there is fabrications that you are diminishing. So if someone is to ask you about all these books of Ibn Abi Dunya and Imam Tabarani and Abu Shaykh, that do they have fabrications, then you will very calmly say that yes, they do have. You will reply in affirmative. And you won't even for a moment look at the think that this will diminish the greatness of the author. So you will understand that if there are few fabrications, it does not take anything away from the integrity of the author. So that's why you don't have to come up with silly arguments just to defend one book. Nevertheless, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, he commented here and he said, وَأَفَادَ أَنَّ غَيْرَهُ مِنَ الْأَحَادِيثِ الضَّعِيفَةِ التي يحتمل صدقها تجوز روايتها في الترغيب والترهيب والفضائل من غير بيان ضعفه. That the statement here of Ibn Hajar rahmallah shows that he's only mentioning if it's not mawdu', you cannot quote it. That means if it is weak, and Sheikh Awama, he's of the view that even if it is very weak, you can still quote it for targhib and tarhib and for fada'il. So he doesn't look at those conditions where they say it does not it should not be very weak. So this Mullah al-Qari also derives that he's only creating the exception of mawdu' narrations. Yeah. Now, like I said, that I wanted to discuss, but very briefly, the books on fabricated narrations. So there are many dedicated books that are written on fabricated narrations. And we mentioned some of these books in lesson 19. So here Mullah al-Qari rahmallah mentions about his book Al-Masnu' fi Ma'rifati al-Mawdu'. He said, وَقَدْ اخْتَصَرْتُ, that I have very briefly mentioned in a small booklet, the ahadith اتفقوا على وضعها وبطلان أصلها, where scholars are unanimous that they are fabrications, and I have called it Al-Masnu'. And thereafter he says, لا يستغني الطالب عنه, that no student of hadith is independent of this. So this obviously means that we should all read this book. Then besides that, he also wrote Al-Asrar al-Marfu'a fil Akhbar al-Mawdu'a, which is called Al-Mawdu'at al-Kubra. Now to quote a few of the other books. So the very first known book which has been written on Mawdu'at is a book. The name of the book is Al-Mawdu'at by Abu Sa'id Muhammad bin Ali Isbahani al-Naqash. So he passed away in the year 414 Hijri. In this book, you will find Imam Dhahabi rahmallah and Ibn Hajar rahmallah quoting from it a lot. So that means until about 600 years ago, this book was available. So now, if any of you are interested, you can first research to see whether there is a manuscript somewhere in one of the libraries, or whether it is mafqud. If you find a manuscript, it's one book which you can make tahqiq of because it's not yet printed. So that was the very first book on Mawdu'at. Thereafter, Allama Tahir Maqdisi, who passed away in the year 507, he wrote Tadhkiratul Mawdu'at. Then few years later, Allama Jawrqani, who passed away in the year 543, he wrote Al-Abatil wal-Manakir wal-Saha wal-Mashahir. So this book here is also printed, and this was the third known book. Then Allama Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah, he wrote Al-Mawdu'at, and we discussed briefly about it in Muqaddama Ibn Salah, that it is a brilliant book for an advanced scholar, because you will be able to detect which narrations are not really fabricated, but it's a very important book. Thereafter, Allama Saghani rahmallah, so this is going in order. Allama Saghani rahmallah, he passed away in the year 650, so he wrote his Al-Mawdu'at. So his, with regard to this, it's also a good book, but he added one narration of Sahih Muslim in his book. Then Allama Dhahabi rahmallah, who came, was about 100 years later, he passed away in the year 748. He condensed the book of Ibn al-Jawzi and he called it Al-Khis Kitab al-Mawdu'at. Thereafter, Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, he came. Allama Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, wrote Al-Munar al-Munif. So Al-Munar al-Munif of in this book here, he discussed a lot of principles and laws of Mawdu' narrations. So this book is valuable for that all the laws of Mawdu' narrations, you can go to this kitab. Yeah. Then and he also condensed the book of Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah, but also in his book there are some narrations which are not fabrications. Thereafter, Allama Suyuti rahmallah, and Allama Suyuti's death, you have to know it because it's 9/11. So he wrote Al-Al al-Masnu'a fil Ahadith al-Mawdu'a. So this here is, he abridged the book of Ibn al-Jawzi, and he also corrected what he felt was graded incorrectly. And obviously now scholars will either, some will take the side of Allama Suyuti and some will take the side, because Allama Suyuti is on a one extreme of being very lenient, and Ibn al-Jawzi is on the other extreme. So scholars will sometimes prefer what Ibn al-Jawzi said and sometimes prefer what Allama Suyuti rahmallah said. Thereafter, Ibn Arraq or Iraqi, there's two ways of pronouncing it. He wrote Tanzil Shari'at al-Marfu'a, and he summarized the books before him. So this here book is valuable because in this book he adds a list of a lot of fabricators. So when we do asanid, inshallah, then we'll explain to you how to learn asanid. So one of the stages when we are learning narrators is where we memorize the names of famous fabricators, so that the minute they come in a chain, you already know that this particular chain is fabricated. So now you simply have to look whether the matan is supported with other chains. But that's like the fourth stage. There's a whole lot of stages which we go through to study asanid. We start off with Sahaba and then the students, and like in that way. Nevertheless, then the book which comes after that is Al-Fawaid al-Majmu'a fil Ahadith al-Mawdu'a by Shawkani. So he summarized all the books before him, and he even claimed that if you have this one book, then it will be as if you had all the earlier books. So you just have to get this one book because he summarized it. And he also corrected some of what he felt were incorrect verdicts. So these are all which were dedicated to mawdu' narrations. Then there are books which generally mention the verdict on famous narrations. So they clarify whether a narration is suitable or not. So it's not being specified to mawdu' narrations. They are just telling you the ruling of a narration. So they can even tell you whether it's sahih, whether it's hasan, they're telling you the grade. The most famous and the best book is Maqasirul Hasana fi Bayani Kathir. So in fact, Fazlur Rahman till now he still says that it is the best book. Thereafter, Alama Sakhawi rahmallah. So in this book, Al-Maqasirul Hasana, there are, if I remember, I think 1,356 narrations. So thereafter, Ibn Adayba here wrote Tamyiz min al-Khabith fima yadurru ala alsanat al-nas min al-Ḥadīth, and it is a summary of Maqasir al-Hasana. And thereafter, Kashf al-Khafa wa Mazul al-Bas amma ishtahara min al-Ahadith ala alsanat al-nas by Ulama Ajluni rahmallah. So this year, it's double, more than double of Maqasir al-Hasana, because it's 3,281 narrations. So these are a few books, and then on top, Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he said فَيُرَكِّبَ لَهُ إِسْنَادًا صَحِيحًا لِيَرُوجَ. So that some scholars, or he mentioned that they would take the ثُمَّ الْمَرْوِي تَارَةً يَخْتَرِعُ الْوَادِي وَتَارَةً يَأْخُذُ كَلَامَ غَيْرِهِ كَبَعْضِ السَّلَفِ فِي الصَّالِحِ. That they take the words of others and attribute it to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So with regards to that, Sheikh Abu Hafs al-Mawsili, he passed away in the year 624. He wrote a concise book on statements which are established from Sahaba and Tabi'in, but they have been incorrectly attributed to others. So when you say to others, at times maybe to another Sahabi it was attributed, or at times it was even mistakenly attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the title of his book is Al-Wuquf ala al-Mawquf, and it has 151 narrations. And then recently, Muhammad Amr Abdul Latif, he published a more detailed book, and the name of his book is Tabyīz al-Sahifa. So you don't confuse it with Tabyīz al-Sahifa of Allama Suyuti, where he speaks about the Fadail of Imam Abu Hanifa. This here is Tabyīz al-Sahifa bi Usul al-Ahadith al-Da'ifa, and it is published by Maktabah Ibn al-Jawzi. And then besides all of these, when you go to the books of earlier scholars, you go like to the books of Al-Majruhin and all of these kind of books, even the books of Imam Bukhari, Tariq al-Kabir, etc. They discuss weak narrators, and they discuss those who are liars and fabricators. And then they sometimes also, in many of these kind of books, they will mention the narrations which those narrators who are liars and who are weak, some narrations which they quoted. But this year you will benefit more after you advance more, because sometimes they are only talking about the sanad. So there will be a hadith which comes even in Bukhari, which is in Sahih al-Bukhari, but when it's this particular narrator is fabricated a sanad. So if you just have to pick up that book, you might think that the narration is a fabrication, but the matan could be transmitted via reliable narrators, and hence it is authentic. Moving on, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, والقسم الثاني من أقسام المردود وهو ما يكون بسبب تهمة الراوي بالكذب وهو المتروك. So you can see in just almost just more than a line, he speaks about the second type, second type of blemish on a narrator. Because remember, we are talking here about at-ta'nu fi ruwatim. So the second type is where a person is accused of lying, and he's saying that it will be the narration will be called matruk. So this is where he's explaining that it's not established that a reporter lied in hadith, but he has been caught lying in other issues. Maybe he speaks lies in his day-to-day conversation. So it's not established that he fabricated or lied against the Prophet ﷺ. But this here creates a taint on his reputation. First of all, lying is such a major sin. And you know all the various ahadith and even the Quranic ayat about lying. So, but it does make us doubtful that if he can lie in normal talk, then it is very possible that he could also lie when transmitting this report from the Prophet ﷺ. But we cannot say with absolute conviction that he is indeed fabricating. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah brought this here as a separate chapter. جعله قسما مستقلا وسماه متروكا لأن اتهام الراوي بالكذب مع تفرده لا يسوغ الحكم بالوضع. Because we cannot say that this with absolute conviction that this person is definitely fabricating against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So therefore this here it is amongst the lowest of the low, but it is slightly better than a mawdu' narration. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah is stating that such a narration will be called matruk. And he gave an example which Alama Munawi rahmallah mentioned. ومثل له المصنف بحديث سرقة الدقيق عن فرقد عن مرة عن أبي بكر وحديث عمرو بن شمر عن جابر الجعفي عن الحارث عن علي. So he's explaining that you can see if you have these kind of narrators who are known to lie, then you can call this narration as matruk. Here, Sheikh Abdul Haq Dahlawi clarified that this actually refers to a person who is habitual of lying. والذي يقع الكذب منه أحيانا نادرا في كلامه غير الحديث النبوي فذلك غير مؤثر في تسمية حديث بالموضوع أو المتروك وإن كان معصية. So this is what Ibn Hajar rahmallah is discussed here. As you can see, he just touched on the topic. He did not go into much detail like he done of mawdu'. All Ibn Hajar rahmallah is saying here that if a person is accused of lying, then his narration is called matruk. However, here we need to explore this a bit more further, and we need to discuss it in a bit more detail. So in the beginning of this kitab, you know, Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he gave the overview of all those who wrote on istilah before him. So he took the name of Alama Rama Hurmuzi and Alama Hakim and Alama Khatib, and he also then praised Ibn Salah rahimahullah. Now here, if you have to look, none of these scholars ever defined a matruk in the way that Ibn Hajar rahmallah just mentioned here. Neither did they even bring a dedicated chapter like what Ibn Hajar rahmallah brought here, mentioning it as a separate point. So rather, we find that if we have to really go through their books, you will find that they mentioned the term in passing. They maybe even quoted it from someone else, and they didn't even elaborate on it. So for example, if you take Alama Rama Hurmuzi, so he is talking about mistakes. And thereafter, he brings the quotation of Abdurrahman bin Mahdi using the term that thalathatun, that al-muhaddithuna thalatha, muhaddithuna of three types, rajulun hafizun mutqinun. Thereafter, the second one is وآخر يوهم والغالب على حديث الصحة, that sometimes a person makes mistakes, but when you start to take the percentage, majority of his narrations are authentic. فهذا لا يترك حديثه. And then he explains the third type, والآخر يوهم والغالب على حديث الوهم فهذا متروك الحديث. Today he used the term متروك الحديث, but he used it for someone who makes lots of mistakes. So he's not using it according to how Ibn Hajar rahmallah just explained here. Likewise, the student of Imam Hakim rahmallah, Alama Khalili rahmallah, he brought the term in passing when discussing shadh. So he explained the meaning of shadh. He first explained from Imam Shafi'i rahmallah, etc. And thereafter, he explains الشاذ والذي عليه حفاظ الحديث الشاذ ما ليس له إلا إسناد واحد يشذ بذلك شيخ ثقة كان أو غير ثقة فما كان عن غير ثقة فمتروك. So look at the definition for matruk. It is that where it's a person who's not reliable is the only person who is narrating the narration. So you can see it doesn't even come close to what Ibn Hajar rahmallah just mentioned. Then when we go to the books of Allama Khatib rahmallah, he also just mentioned the word matruk in passing by actually just explaining a quotation. And it's still very different to how Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned it here. So he says that Ahmad bin Salih, he explained with regards to Maslama bin Ali, لا يترك حديث رجل حتى يجتمع الجميع على ترك حديثه. That I will not leave out the narrations of a person until everybody left out his narrations. So then, if they have to, you can say that fulanun matruk. You can then say that this person is matruk. So you can see that they did not use it for a person who lies in his day-to-day conversation. And then taking from Allama Khatib ibn Salah rahmallah, also he just brought the same quotation, and he did not bring any dedicated chapter, nor did he define the term like Ibn Hajar rahmallah. Yes, Ibn Salah did mention it at another place when discussing the maratib, so we will discuss that shortly inshallah. Then after Ibn Salah rahimahullah, before Ibn Hajar, those who worked on the book of Ibn Salah, they too, like Imam Nawawi rahmallah, Allama Zarkashi rahmallah, and even the teacher of Ibn Hajar, in whose company Ibn Hajar stayed for 10 years, learning only mustalahat and ulum al-hadith, Allama Iraqi rahmallah, he did not explain matruk as Ibn Hajar rahmallah just done. So this here is with regards to the books of mustalah. Then when we go to the actual books of earlier scholars, they also did not use the term according to how Ibn Hajar rahmallah explained. Now, why again are we learning all this istilahat? We are learning it because we want to understand how earlier scholars use the term. So if we have to just study Nuzha an-Naḍar, and if you have to look at this here, now when you're going to go to the books of earlier scholars and you're going to see them, firstly, they don't even explain grade a hadith as matruk. They grade the narrators as matruk. We'll discuss that shortly. But you all think that maybe this person lies. But we'll explain that they use it in a completely different way. And that is why Ibrahim al-Lahim says, ووصف الأحاديث بهذا بأن يقال هذا الحديث متروك بالمعنى الذي حرره ابن حجر هنا قليل جدا في كلام الأئمة إن لم يكن معدوما. It's almost, you cannot find any of the previous scholars using the term matruk as Ibn Hajar rahmallah just explained here. So when we study how they use the term, we find that they very frequently use the matruk to describe a narrator. So remember again, not a narration, they use it to describe a narrator, a human being who fabricated a hadith. So this here is in stark difference what Ibn Hajar rahmallah just explained. So to give you some examples, Ibn Abi Hatim rahmallah, he says that he asked his father with regards to a narration which is narrated via Muhammad bin Shurahbil, that Mughira bin Shu'bah radiyallahu anhu said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said with regards to the wife of a person who goes missing. So here amra'atu hatta ya'ti ahal bayan, that you will continue being his wife. That means you cannot now, she cannot go and marry someone else if a person gets lost. So this narration here, Abu Hatim rahmallah said, هذا حديث munkar. Thereafter explaining Muhammad bin Shurahbil, so he's not explaining the narration, he's explaining the narrator. He said matrukul hadith, and after that he's matrukul hadith, and he explains that he narrates from Mughira a hadith manakir abatil. So you can see fabrications, he narrates fabrications from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That means he lies in a hadith of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yet Abu Hatim rahmallah and his son are referring to him as matruk. Likewise, Barqani says that he asked Imam Darqutni rahmallah with regards to Ismail bin Abi Ziyad. So Imam Darqutni said, matrukun yada'u al-hadith. This is again very different compared to what Ibn Hajar. Ibn Hajar is making it completely different from the first type of wada'. But here you can see he's describing a fabricator as matruk. Likewise, when Imam Hakim rahmallah asked him about Ghulam al-Khalil, so he said, Yada'ul hadith matrukun. He fabricates a hadith, he is matruk. So it contradicts what Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned here. On another occasion, Imam Hakim rahmallah asked Imam Darqutni about Abdullah bin Muhammad. So he said, matrukun yada'u. that he is matruk and he fabricates. What's the meaning of fabricate? He lies in the Ḥadīth of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So that goes against what Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned here. So then Imam Hakim rahmallah, he also started to use the term like this here. So when Sijzi asked Imam Hakim about Walid bin Salama, he said, Imam Hakim rahmallah replied that he narrates a hadith mawdu'a wa huwa matrukul hadith. So can you see? He's using matrukul hadith for a person who lies in the ahadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then later scholars also accepted this terminology. But we'll have to end the lesson abruptly because, like I told you, there's 40 minutes left for Maghrib Salah. They're only giving me 5 minutes for Sunnats, and then we have to make Jamaat for Asr. So, inshallah, we'll continue on Saturday. Until then, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.